welcome to another episode of Fans in Motion. As my partner in crime, Andy, who is not here, would say, the ultimate Night Ranger podcast that you didn't know you needed. So joining me today is the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Kevin Rankin from the what is it, like the new wave legends, Flock of Seagulls, and ultimate Night Ranger fan. So Kevin, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you jumping on with me on such short notice.
My pleasure, Josh. Thanks, buddy.
So Andy and Brent weren't able to record with me this week, and I had a change of schedule with my kiddo. And so me and Kevin have been working on a few things, and I said, Kevin, hey, can you help me out? And here he is. So
yeah, man. Let's talk Night Ranger.
We're going to talk night. We're going to talk all kinds of stuff. So I mean, from 35,000 feet up, I can tell you Kevin is currently the drummer for A Flock of Seagulls. Now, when I started doing some research, I was a little pissed that you guys still didn't have the hair thing going, right? Well, I mean, you're playing along, but it's like, all right, but it's going to be interesting because we're going to talk about Night Ranger, but I want to kind of eventually talk about, because if you're listening to this, you're a hardcore Night Ranger fan, and what do we always say? Oh man, they got to play Sister Christian? That's like there's more than that. Well, let's look at it from that view of Flock of Seagulls, an iconic 80's band that has an iconic song. And if you're not a hardcore Flock of Seagulls fan, that's the song and the image, just like a lot of people's image and song that they know of Night Ranger is Sister Christian.
Right.
So we're going to talk about those dynamics and everything, but let's start at the beginning. So Kevin, where does it all start for you? Where are you born? Where are you raised?
I grew up in Montana, actually, which is where I got to see my very first concert. Saw Night Ranger on the Midnight Madness tour with ZZ Top in 1984 in Great Falls, Montana. But I grew up, for the most part, I was out in a cabin in the woods outside of Bozeman, Montana for all of my formative years.
Now, see, I'm from Ohio, and I just automatically assume that when you say Montana, right? Like,
right.
Isn't every place a
cabin? Yeah, right. Well, you're military. I grew up near the Air Force Base in Great Falls for a while, so there's a little military presence. Yeah. I spent a lot of those years where we discovered all the beauty of Night Ranger in the remote parts of Montana where there were no people around, and all I got to do was just blast my music as loud as I could. And,
isn't all Montana remote?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Hey, once a year we pack up, put on our Sunday best, and we go into Billings. So Montana, what? So I know a little bit, mostly like the southern part where you got Billings and you have Battle Little Bighorn and all that stuff. Now, where are you at?
That's South Dakota.
That's
okay.
No. Battle Little Bighorn that's in Montana. Billings, right?
No. I think, and you might even be right, man. If I'm wrong, then I apologize. But I was thinking it was near Custer's, Custer National Park, or Custer State Park. Regardless, that eastern part, eastern Montana is Billings, and the southern part is Bozeman, which is where I'm from. Great Falls is more central. Missoula is up in the north, and so Great Falls and Billings are kind of the more populated areas. Bozeman and Missoula are the college towns, and that's pretty much all you see in Montana.
Bighorn County, Montana is the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So I need to know exactly where you're at. So what did you say that city was?
I'm from Bozeman,
Montana. So let's see here. A lot of green.
I can't believe I missed the Bighorn. Yeah, that's crazy.
All right. So yeah, you're what is that one highway there? Highway 90. We'll take you
Yeah.
to. Did you ever go see the Billing Mustangs while you're out there?
Oh yeah, I was in Billings quite a bit on tour. With my, as soon as I started playing drums, I did this circuit right from Billings, which is in upper, I guess, North Dakota. This circuit along 90, all the way over to all the way out to Seattle. So you'd have like this, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota circuit, all the way to Minnesota. But that was as far as the touring thing would take me. But Billings was kind of like the big city that we'd all go play when we were in Montana. And how do you know the Mustangs, the baseball team?
Well, I mean, I've been in southern Montana before, but I'm a Reds fan, so they were the
Oh,
Reds.
the farm team.
Yeah, but who doesn't know about Billings? I mean, it's a thriving metropolis. So,
Yeah.
but you so w- I'm kind of going to skip ahead, but you're talking about that touring circuit there. How was the music scene, in that area being so remote? Um, I guess like off the top of my head, I can't think of bands that came from that area. I mean, even bands, let's say like Hinder, you got Oklahoma City. There's
Right,
always, you got Slipknot from Iowa, but
right.
off the top of my head, um, I can't think of, bands coming out of that area. So was like in 1984, 85, and so forth, was there a thriving music scene up there?
No, see, that's the thing. Everybody needs to leave Montana to go do music, which is what I did.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, in the 80's, I was going through high school and then college. And so I was touring, playing cover bands and some original stuff. You throw in, well, one original song for every 10, because people don't want to hear your originals unless you kind of style them in whatever form sounds like, the bands that are popular at the time. But we do lots of Night Ranger for sure. We always did Don't Tell Me. We always did You Can Still Rock in America. And I would set up my drum kit just like Kelly off to the side. And the songs that I was singing kind of got a little showcase piece there. And, it was great because we had a keyboardist in the band. So, like Night Ranger, it's great that you can showcase the drums and the keyboards on two separate risers and not have it look off center. Doesn't really work with A Flock of Seagulls very well because I'm kind of tucked back behind my boss, but yeah, no, most people they don't find their musical fulfillment staying in Montana for sure.
Now, did be bordering Canada, did that Canadian, because if you go to like Buffalo or upstate New York, you're pretty much, you're blending in with all that Canadian. I think you're issued like a Kim Mitchell cassette tape or something up there.
Yeah, right.
So did
Kim
that
Mitchell.
stuff did that stuff bleed in to
Yeah,
Montana? I mean, where you listen to, Rush and Triumph and all those Canadian bands. I mean,
yeah,
Triumph had obviously a little bit more success and Rush, obviously, but like, like I said, I mentioned Kim Mitchell, where
yeah.
you go 100 miles south of Canada, the Canadian border.
People
Kim
don't
who?
know
Yeah, but
unless you're a huge Rush fan, because Kim Mitchell was a big part of
yeah,
Rush's history too. But that's interesting that you mentioned that a lot of people consider Montana like Canada South,
yeah.
and we'd go across the border, to go to Calgary and Edmonton and some of the cities that were directly north in Alberta. But yeah, Rush became a huge thing in all the small towns. I think, probably in the Midwest, people could relate to a lot of the songs from Rush. I wasn't a hardcore Rush fan because as a drummer, you were either in the Neil Peart drum camp for Rush or you were John Bonham Zeppelin camp. And I was probably more Bonham, but my 24-year-old son is such a rabid Rush fan. And I got to see the band 5 or 6 times, and he'll never let me live it down that I never got him to see them before they retired. And so I feel a little bad about that. But our guitarist from A Flock of Seagulls is Toronto, and he lives in Toronto. He's from Toronto. He was on the same record label as Rush, and he his band Spoons they were a big Canadian band, and so everybody assumed because they were Canadian that they had to somehow be tied into Rush, and there's a chip on their shoulder about that. But I don't know how you could fault anybody for seeing how brilliant that band was, but
Yeah. Um, Yeah, like I said, and what was the band Kim Mitchell was in before he went solo?
Uh,
Max Webster.
yeah,
Uh,
Max Webster and Max Webster, like, and Rush actually did a song together. So
really?
yeah, they did it because I interviewed a guy that works a lot with Whitesnake. He produces all Dave Coverdale stuff down in Reno, Tom Gordon, and he had just redone this song that Max Webster did with Rush and with it was a fundraiser for Native American arts, and the song is so huge, and I didn't even know about it. And Rush fans came through the woodwork, finally when they found out about the Max Webster connection. But
Um,
that's impressive that from Ohio that you would
well,
know Mitchell and
I was in the military and I spent a lot of time with some guys from upstate New York. So, hey, you don't know Kim Mitchell? Like, fuck no, I don't know Kim Mitchell.
yeah.
I'm from fucking Ohio.
We just played with
So
Kim Mitchell, actually.
really.
Yeah, we did a show up in London, Ontario with him. So it was a weird pairing of us. Brett Michaels was on the gig. Cyndi Lauper was on the gig. And yeah, and Kim Mitchell. Oh, and from Mr. Richard Page. But yeah, weird lineup and A Flock of Seagulls right in the midst of it all,
Yeah. Like I said, if you're in upstate New York, 1985, you had Kim Mitchell cassette tape, roast beef on Weck in the other hand.
Yeah.
Um, so was drums the first instrument that you gravitated to, or did you go some
Oh,
other instrument and then end up with drums?
I wish I could say drums were. I played clarinet first. My dad was a Dixieland jazz player, and he was in these bands, and I just thought it was super cool to go watch him with his band. And then I hit puberty, and I realized, man, girls just don't gravitate towards the drummer or towards the clarinetist. I saw the first Motley Crue video, and I said, "Oh, okay, that's it. Drums is it." I have an uncle who was a jazz drummer in Chicago, and I went to go see his drums, and it changed everything. And that was the year that I got to see Night Ranger 2, and yeah, it was game over at that point. That was all I wanted to do.
So when did you decide that, you know, I mean, maybe you didn't. I guess where I'm getting at is how did you get out of Montana? Did you leave Montana knowing that you were wanting to do a music career, or was it you left Montana with the broad and somehow fell into the music career? How how did leaving Montana work?
I dragged the broad with me. It was funny. I was married to my childhood sweetheart. We met when we were 12 before I started playing drums. But I had always wanted to go to LA. It was the 80's, man. Everybody was going to LA to Sunset Strip, and they were going to go rock and become rock stars. I stayed behind when all of my friends went to Los Angeles, and I finished university at Montana State. And it was kind of like the backup plan. I knew I wanted music to be everything for me, and I got a music studio teaching minor, but sociology was my main focus. And so I got a bachelor's in that, and I was a youth counselor for a while. And then, I was going to go out to Portland. Actually, I was interested in criminology. I wanted to be a serial killer uh, profiler. I wanted to be a criminal profiler, and Silence of the Lambs came out. I wanted to do that along with rock stardom. And uh, as I was going to college, a bunch of bands that were touring, I would always get on the concert committee, and I would go drum tech, or I would go set up and run spotlights, and I kind of be part of that whole scene just to kind of witness what was going on at the major levels. And so I worked with a lot of bands that were really popping in the 80's for sure. Poison, Warrant, Warrant, Sarah Singer, Winger, and Cinderella, and like those, the big hair bands. And then there was the concert committee at the college put together a couple of big shows at the fairgrounds for these up and coming artists, because the grunge thing was just starting to take off. So we brought in Alice in Chains, and I saw Alice in Chains right before they took off. Got to know the drummer Sean Kinney a little bit, and I thought, oh wow, this is a new energy for a lot of this music. And so I connected with that. In my art classes, one of the kids there said, you ought to book my cousin's band. I get, no, it's his brother. Yeah. So my brother Barry, or my brother Jeff, Barry Ament was my classmate. Jeff was in this band, Mookie Baylock. He said, you should book Mookie Baylock to come in and play this show. So we had them coming in. Between the time that we booked them and the time that they played, they had changed their name to Pearl Jam because they got picked up on the record deal and they had to change the name. So Pearl Jam came in right at the formative time for that band. Alive, the video had just come out. They changed drummers at that point, and they had one guy for all of their crew. One guy was setting up drums, guitar, bass, setting up the testing, checking monitors, and teching everything without really knowing anything about drums. So when they brought in the drum kit, I saw him set it up, and it was kind of set up funky. And I said, "Hey man, you want me to tune that kit up?" And he's like, "No, he likes it that way." And I'm looking at this drum set thinking, nobody could play a kit like this. The drums, none of the heads were even tightened down, and the drums were kind of off kilter. So I tightened up the floor toms and tuned those up. And then Dave Abruzzese drums, the drummer walks in and he's playing the kit. He's like, "Man, Scully, the tech." It's like, "Dude, these sound great." And he looks over at me, knowing that I got on the kit, and he says, "Dave, this is the local, this is the dude that tuned up your stuff." So Dave and I hit it off. We hung out all day, kind of like, we talked about Kelly, Kiki. Mm-hmm. Dave had joined the band fairly recently, and the meteoric rise for that band was just starting to explode. And so we hung out all day. At the show, I was just kind of like an appendage, and we were hanging backstage, and he said, "Man, I don't even have crew. We're going to Europe for like the next 6 weeks. I'd love to have some help." And I said, "Man, now I'm going to college. I'm getting married in a couple of months, and between you and me, I don't want to set up somebody else's drums, right?" But I said, "Let's stay in touch," thinking I'd never hear from him again. And he wrote me a letter talking. He charted out the parts of the songs that I was talking to him about, and he said, "Dude, when I get back from tour, we should have you come out to Seattle." So on spring break, I went out and stayed with him for a couple of weeks, and I realized, wow, this is an inside look at somebody that just made it. He just got his Pearl Jam Platinum card, and I was this broke college kid and wide-eyed, like stars in my eyes kind of thing. And he treated me and my fiance like stars. He took us out to dinner, and we went in the studio while they were recording the second album, and he's showing me all the drum parts. And it was everything I wanted from music. And so I was going to move to Seattle like everybody else was, to get into the music scene, but couldn't convince my fiance or my wife that Seattle was the place, because it just felt too big to her to come from Montana. But I helped a friend move to Portland, and I loved Portland. I went out to the Northwest, and I had just graduated college, and it was time, for the next step. Portland wasn't taking off the way Seattle was, but I called Dave up and I said, "Hey man, do you know anybody in Portland?" And he goes, "Dude, all the promoters, everybody I work with in the business, they're all moving to Portland. That's the place." He said, "I can totally help you out." So I moved to Portland. I had my bandmates with me, had them come out to Portland, and we were going to have Dave's contacts help us out. And he got fired right after I got to Portland and disappeared. At that point, the band was so big. They were the biggest band on the planet, and it was a really difficult time for him. And again, it was my eye opener. I saw somebody who got to be at the top of the heap and then completely have the rug pulled out from underneath, and as a person who wanted to play music for a living, I saw both sides of the spectrum, and I felt like, well, I'm glad I got my backup plan for my degree. And Portland really felt like it became home. I was out hustling the band that I was in were my buddies in college, but I saw this other band that I right after I moved out, that was a female fronted project, and this girl that fronted this band played like I'd never seen. To this day, she was probably the greatest songwriter of anybody I've ever worked with. Her name was Leah Kruger. The band was called On a Llama, weird band name for sure. But I was so blown away by this chick, her voice and the songwriting, and she was this wicked, funky bass player. And it turned out they needed a drummer to come and do this showcase for a label, and they asked if I could do it the next day in Seattle. So I had less than 24 hours to learn the stuff. I immediately joined that band, and for the next 4.5 years, just chased it, man. To the point where we were in the midst of signing a record deal, and one of those deals got, kind of got pulled out from underneath. And again, I got to see, peaks and valleys. But
Well,
that's probably more of the Northwest story for you than you wanted to hear. But
no, well, again, this is, the stories I like, because it always is. It's weird how opportunity meets, and obviously, if you've been, practicing your skill, it's not just luck. It's like when that luck hits, you got to have the talent and everything there to take opportunity of it. But just, hey, we're going to book a band that's half named after Mookie Wilson of the Mets.
right.
All right. Okay. You don't think twice about it, but then they become Pearl Jam.
Right.
You get that connection. And just with a lot of groups, it's always interesting to hear the stories or just wonder about it. How you have that high of being a rock star. Just, helping out Night Ranger, 3 decades after, the MTV era.
Right.
It's still neat to see. I can't imagine what it would be like back then, but it's addictive. It's fun. It's cool to see that. And I always wondered kind of, there's always someone there for you. It's loud, and then all of a sudden, nothing. You're just there by yourself. No one wants to talk to you. How does that fuck with someone's psyche? And I always talk about the story of Bobby Blotzer wrote a book, and he kind of probably the best scenario of it. So, grunge hits, they're out of work, but he's making good money. He has coin operated machines, and he's got this like carpet cleaning business, right? And he's like, dude, it's, it's carpet cleaning, but I'm still making good bank. So he talks about this one landlord that he always helps. He wanted him to clean a business or apartment in a bad neighborhood, which he never did, but he's going to help this guy out. So he's got to lug his shit up like, like a 3rd floor apartment building, and it's a bad neighborhood. So he's constantly looking out at his equipment that's sitting right outside the door because he couldn't get all of it in. So he's sitting there cleaning this carpet in this bad neighborhood in this shitty old, apartment. And he looks out to see if his equipment's still there. And as he looks, right beyond that, all the way out in the distance, is the LA Forum. And he's like, he goes, it just hit me that 7 years ago, I was headlining that place.
Right.
And it's like, and that I give him credit for, because he's the one, a lot of these musicians, they don't, write about that but he wrote about it. And I always thought like, wow, like that tells you. So, like when you're talking about Dave having those highs and lows and just kind of going off the grid, heck, that might have been the best thing for him. Just, you know what I mean? Just,
well, Dave and I talk a lot now. He disappeared for a few years, and the sad thing for me, and I'm glad you pointed out that about Bobby, and I hadn't heard that story about Blotzer, but I know that Bobby a little bit. The vulnerability, from somebody in this business is rare, especially when you hear about the shitty times, because the pride of a lot of guys that have musical success, they're not talking about the other side of things, right, where they're struggling. And I used to love the TV shows that would come on like VH1 where they talk about where are they now. And after the 80s music scene kind of got enveloped by the 80s grunge or the 90s grunge thing, they were showing guys from Kicks like painting billboards and working menial, minimum wage jobs because they didn't have anything as a backup just in case. Or they partied it all away, right? And so they didn't have anything set in the bank. I mean, good for Blotzer for having a business, but Dave Abruzzese, when he was fired, it was really tough. I got to see so much of the stuff behind the scenes in the years leading up to his termination. You know, I would go out and see some shows on the road, and I'd watch the way he was treated. And I thought, man, I could relate a lot because he was a very outgoing guy. You know, I get teased sometimes because I'm the guy that's out talking to kids in the crowd. And I love it when people bring, you know, their teenagers, because I remember how much music did for me when I was a teenager. It saved my freaking life, man. And so when I see somebody that brings a kid out, I'll go out and I'll bring him a pair of sticks and we'll talk and we'll hang out and talk about life and real life, not fake, you know, stuff. And so with Dave, when things were leading up to his termination, he was getting shit left and right. He'd do an article for in Modern Drummer where they'd interview him, and he'd get yelled at because he was, you know, he was approachable from the fans, and he was actually, you know, vulnerable and opening up about his life when it was supposed to be aloof and mysterious. And so that was kind of the unseating for him, that his personality cost him the gig, and it was just because he was a good guy. Now, I know a million people might not get that. You know, they might think, oh, you know, like at least he had that window. But it's unfortunate that right now it's still a huge wound for him. You know, I look at his socials and I watch his engagement, and I've had him on my podcast a couple of times talking about he got snubbed, you know, Oregon or the Rock and Roll
Hall of Fame.
The Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Right. Like he wasn't invited.
Like,
they had 3 other drummers and they were all invited and he wasn't.
Well, they didn't even put him in the hall. It's like, how can you have the drummer who was there for years at the height?
The height.
Like
all the videos.
He was on the 10 tour. He was on Versus. He was on Vitalogy. I lost track after that, but anyway.
No, but that's it. Yeah. I mean, that was after Vitalogy was when he's gone.
But that's the height. Like that is what, you know, when you do a history of Pearl Jam or you do a movie of Pearl Jam, that's the area you're going to. You're not going to, you know, whatever albums are after that, you know. I don't even know what they are. But and he doesn't get into the Hall of Fame.
It's crazy.
And the band doesn't push for it.
Yeah.
That's
I know. Yeah, he got fucked, bro. I mean, it's really hard for me to watch because it is a really tough pill for him to swallow. And I sometimes will reach out to him and say, man, everybody's pulling for you, you know? I mean, everybody is, and everybody knows you got fucked, and it is a drag. But at some point for him, I hope he's able to realize, and what I told him at that point when he got canned, I tried to find him. I drove up to his house because I was worried about him, and he was gone. And that same tech that I told you about earlier lived next door to him. And he was telling me, he said, dude, Dave took off in the middle of the night. I don't know where he went. I knew he was from Houston, so I thought he might have gone back to Texas. Turns out he went to a shaman down here, I think New Mexico or Arizona, talked to, he kind of like talked to a shaman about his identity. You lose your identity when the band that you were iconic with just strips you from that. Mm-hmm. And I told him I could give a fuck about Pearl Jam. You were the guy that spent time with me till I got to know you as a person. And I loved that era of the band, and I loved the band because of you, but I loved you for you. It had nothing to do with that band, you know? And when he was no longer in the band, people probably didn't want to hang with him because they wanted a part of that band, and I could care less. You know, I'd rather know somebody for their decency and their character. And so that's what I hope he finds strength in. That's his legacy for me. It's not that era in Pearl Jam, is that he took a kid who had stars in his eyes and showed him how you could still be an approachable, generous, good human being, even at the biggest point of your career, you know? So I did mention it to him in the podcast that I did with him, but I'm hopeful that he really can find peace in his heart from those times, you know. It's tough, you know, it is a hard thing, but.
And then that rock and like say, you know, it's like maybe right when you're getting to the point you're okay with it, Rock and Roll Fame comes up, that happened. I mean, that right there was a perfect time to where that could have healed everything.
Yeah, you're right.
You don't even have to be sitting with the band. Just, hey, I'm in the Rock and Roll Fame. It's acknowledged.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah,
I,
but it
I,
sounds like it's good that you know all this stuff about it. Like, yeah, that's
I,
cool.
I guess, I mean, I guess that I guess if you want to look at a bright point, I don't know, bright points, but that we can have this discussion about it
Yeah,
merits his involvement with the band.
yeah, for sure.
If we were having this conversation, I'd be like, he doesn't deserve to be in there. But and I don't really fucking like Pearl Jam. I just
Right,
I just know the history of it, and
sure.
I don't like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to begin with. But
Yeah.
when I saw that, it's kind of like how does Ronnie James Dio not get
Oh,
inducted with Sabbath? But David
yeah,
Coverdale gets inducted with Deep Purple.
right. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. That, yeah,
I enjoyed Coverdale and Glenn Hughes with Purple, but and yeah, okay, that you can't deny some of those albums they did, and Cal Jam '74, such an iconic show, and you got Coverdale and Glenn Hughes there, but you took an iconic band like Sabbath
right.
and reinvented them and made them, you know,
Yeah.
you made them important again. You
Yeah, well,
replaced
there's a
Ozzy fucking Osbourne, and you did it well,
oh
right?
man, yeah, like one of the greatest singers and humans in the business, right? And yeah, there are 100 stories that we could have about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and and not any of them end well. Yeah, but most people in the business know that it's kind of a joke, and I'm not a fan of award shows. I'm not a fan of saying one band is better than another because it's all subjective, right? And so it's like saying, one guitarist is better than another. Well, at what, right? Faster licks or, their tone but, you know, this is not at all. This is a weird thing for me. In October, I was in Portland. I moved the day after I was inducted in the Oregon Music Hall of Fame. And I had to say, well, by the way, I'm moving to New Mexico tomorrow. I felt horrible about it, but Portland and Oregon itself was a really special place for me. It's where all the changes in my life happened with music. And it was a really special thing. And I told the director when they talked about me being inducted, I said, this feels uh, ironic because I'm not a fan of these. And I was on the board of directors for Oregon Music Hall of Fame for a while because of their music education program. They gave out scholarships to kids that were academically there, but they didn't have the finances to go to school to pursue music. I loved that. I loved being able to help sort of push people towards that education. But I didn't want to be in one of the roles. I was never a voting member, and I don't really feel worthy of any of that induction. And the director said, this was about character, man. You were involved a lot in the community, at all levels where you were mentoring, schools and kids and a lot of the bands that, I made contributions to. So I'm grateful, and I don't mean to seem ungrateful in that. And I felt really strange in saying, thank you, Oregon. I'm out of here, but I found a sanctuary here, man. I'm in this amazing place. I don't know if you got to spend any time in New Mexico, but Santa Fe is a really special place to me now. So
I think I drove through it. I maybe took a wrong turn in Albuquerque or something, but
oh,
uh, but uh, um, a lot of desert.
down below, I'm up 8,000 feet. I'm up in the mountains. I'm up in the forest again, right where I wanted to get out of in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go to the city and pursue rock stardom, and I couldn't wait to get out of the mountains. And now I am in the most serene, quiet place. Just I walk out the door up the mountain, with trees and 8,000 feet. It's a little thin air, but it's beautiful, man. It's amazing.
So when grunge hit, did your music that you were playing and hoping to make a career of, did it go towards the grunge, thing, or were you still sticking to the hard rock, scene? Where were you going with that in that era?
I stayed a fan of all of that. I mean, my heart lives with the 80s Sunset Strip era stuff. When I showed up to Portland with my double bass drum kit, the band said, we can put this one over there and, strip things down. I adopted the grunge vibe, the sort of appreciation of it because of Dave Abruzzese. I became a huge Soundgarden fan, and I didn't even really consider that grunge. I was so blown away by Cornell and Matt Cameron, and I liked Alice in Chains, those bands more because I could see, like Alice, I could see the influence that a lot of the 80's Sunset Strip bands had on Alice in Chains. Harmonies, the just real deep rooted guitar solos.
Well, I think Poison took them out in their first tour, if I remember correctly.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I can totally see it.
For the facelift tour. And before grunge hit, they were on Headbangers Ball. So I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
before grunge, I mean, they were in that Skid
Right.
Row
Yeah.
type thing. And yeah, so what you're saying about having that influence, it's there. I mean,
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, you mentioned Sabbath earlier. You could totally see that influence on Soundgarden. You could hear the dark side of Soundgarden, and Cornell, to me, I thought was the most gifted of all of those vocalists. He was the one guy that stood above, because it was really tragic, man. His loss. We did one of the bands I was in Portland. We played shows with Chris on his solo tours, and I was floored by that guy's the depth of his commitment to music and his passion, and his voice was ridiculous, man. And you would appreciate, because I know that you're backstage a lot with like the Night Ranger guys, and so you get to see the real stuff, again, the vulnerable stuff and everyday stuff. The first show that this band I was in played with Chris Cornell, I was on a solo. He was doing the Sun Shower solo tour, probably 2009, maybe, I'm guessing, somewhere around there. And there's a venue in Portland that we were playing, the Roseland Theater. It's a decent sized theater. It's like 1,200 or something like that. We have a shared green room downstairs, and I'm down there, and the manager comes up for Chris, and he said, "Hey, look, man, if we're all sharing, I don't want you getting near him. No eye contact, no talking to him." And I said, "No eye contact?" And he's like, yeah, Chris, he's on thin ice right now. I said, "Oh, okay." So I'm sitting on this couch, and Chris comes downstairs, sits down next to me on the couch, and I'm looking straight ahead at the wall, and he goes, "You all right?" I said, "Yeah, I was not supposed to talk to you, man." He goes, "What?" I said, "Yeah, no, I was instructed to give you some space." And he goes, "Oh, man, well, that's because the last time I was in this room, I had a little bit of a drinking problem and a drug problem." And I said, "Yeah, I'm aware." And he said, "So we had played in Brazil, and apparently I got so fucked up on the beach that I married a Brazilian girl on the beach, and my wife found out about it. So I was in this chair and on this couch when a sheriff came in and served me divorce papers when she found out that I had gotten divorced or got married, again in Brazil." Mm-hmm. He said, "So maybe my manager thought that was going to be a trigger, but we're all good." And I thought, that's a good rock and roll story. I like this, man. But he was great, super fun, down to earth, and what a freaking badass performer.
I mean, that first Audio Slave record, his voice. I mean, I like the Soundgarden stuff, like Bad Motorfinger, all that stuff, but that first Audio Slave record, I mean, it's like it's like 4 instruments.
Yeah,
the drums,
right.
It's
to
me, that's where it
yes.
It peaked. And he did that cool cover of Billie Jean before it kind of became like the cool thing to do of covering songs and slowing them down. So when you was talking about the group, and I apologize for not remembering the name, but you said the record deal kind of got pulled out from under you. Where did it go after that? Were you considering, okay, I got that college degree, do I go back to doing that? Or did you start looking for another gig, or did some luck kind of sprinkle into the mix?
Yeah, well, I said that the rug got pulled out from under. Really, essentially, any person that's out there that may be an upcoming musician, I would recommend them to understand what the business is all about, right? So I was not the contributing writer in most senses. So for that band, it was a 3-piece band. My publishing portion was very small. And so when we were negotiating record deal stuff, I was out hustling to get all the record companies to come find us, get showcases. And one of the companies, this Atlantic rep in New York, said, "Hey, we're coming out to see you, but we were told to maybe just focus on the singer." And I said, "Who told you to focus on her?" And he said, "Your manager." I said, "We don't have a manager." But she did, apparently. And so they were trying to negotiate the deal just for her. And so it was the same old story that you hear a lot of times with bands, where there really wasn't a lot of upfront communication about how we were going to be three musketeers and go off into the sunset, and have a successful partnership in business. That discussion didn't really happen. And so it became too late at the end. And I left right in the midst of signing a deal. She eventually got shelved, and the band didn't take off. But what it did show me was that I had a lot to learn about the music business, a lot to learn about communication. And my idea about success in music was that, we're going to be this united front. We're allies. We're going to go out there. We're going to conquer the world, and we're going to be successful. And we'll share the spoils of our labor. But not everybody had the same idea. And I think it's so important for people, if you're going to be in partnership in music, it's the same thing to be in a relationship, romantic relationship. Got to be on the same page for everything. If you're going to have kids, how are we going to, co-parent? How are we going to, handle discipline? And so I had a lot to learn. I wasn't done with music, but what I did realize is what the bride that I brought out with me from Montana, she'd always taken a back seat to my pursuits of music. And we had talked about having kids, and I really did want to be a dad. I told her, if I don't have what I deem to be what I need from music by 28, let's focus on kids. And that was when I turned 28, when that happened. And so I decided to be a dad. And right after I had my first son, the band Animotion called me. I don't know if you know that band. Obsession was like their big sort of hit song. But the male singer from that band lived in Portland, and he had seen that band that I was in. He was looking for a drummer to do a one-off reunion gig. And at that point, in around 2001, the 80s resurgence was just starting to come back around. The Lilith Fair and the grunge era, those things were kind of out. The early 2000s thing was more industrial, and you had a lot of like bands like White Zombie and that kind of thing hitting rock radio. But the 80s thing was starting to pick up, because most people that grew up in the 80s were just at the point where they're getting a little bit of expendable income. Their jobs freed up a little bit, and they had a little more time and a little more opportunity to go out and see music that was formative in their youth. And so this resurgence of all the 80s bands started popping again. I know Night Ranger too started doing bigger shows and package shows at that point. And so Animotion was going to do a one-off show. I met with the guy, and sight unseen, I mean, we sat down and we just talked, and it was such a great hang that he, hired me for the gig. We did the one gig in Fresno, California. And I was a rocker guy. My nickname's Kevy Metal, right? I mean, most of my buddies knew that I was a hard rock guy, but I grew up with those songs. I was roller skating to those songs. And while I was like, Scorpions was like the band for me. I mean, that era was everything. Like Prince Prince was another person for me that changed my life. And so Prince kind of was this bridge for pop stuff for me. And I roller skated to those songs. So when Animotion came and said, "Yeah, we want to come do this gig," I thought, well, this is a cool step up, without really thinking that anything was going to come from it. The guitarist from that band had been with Rod Stewart already for about 10, 15 years, and he was doing massive arenas. The keyboardist from that band was the guy that played on the Thriller record with Michael Jackson. So Billie Jean, Beat It, that's him on keys. The other people in the band had enough of their own career going that they didn't need Animotion. But that guitarist who was with Rod Stewart said, "Dude, this drummer is really into this. I mean, he's like a rock dude. We should consider doing more shows." And so that turned into a 16-year career with Animotion, where we started doing all these big package shows with all these 80s bands. And I never would have thought that in my musical aspirations that was the direction I was going to go. But I started picking up all these gigs. Animotion was playing with these, a whole bunch of different bands from the era: A Flock of Seagulls, Wang Chung, Berlin, Motels, Tommy Two Tone, New Shoes, like all those bands that were big MTV pop bands. And Missing Persons, like all these bands started asking me to sub for them whenever they needed a drummer. So I was kind of making the circuit of, getting pickup gigs whenever they would come up. And eventually that's how I got the gig with the Flock of Seagulls. The drummer was a good friend of mine, and he burned his hands really bad and couldn't go off and do a cruise through the Caribbean, an 80's cruise. And so they asked me to sub on it. And that has now turned into like this 7th year with the Flock of Seagulls. And we're doing like 100 shows this year. It's nuts. So full transformation from heavy metal to whatever this is.
And going back to talking about the carpet being pulled out from under you, I thought of that. If you're a musician, one of those Lethal Weapon movies where, the hitman, is looking down and the boss is like, "What are you looking at?" And he's like, "To see if I'm standing on plastic." If you're a musician, keep an eye on what you're standing on. If you're standing on a rug, be aware that it could be pulled. And
Yeah.
you're talking about that resurgence of those 80's groups in the early 2000s. Kind of talked about this on other podcasts. It really, to me, that all started in about 1995, where these bands slowly started becoming legacy acts instead of
Right.
recording artists. Started with like the Eagles.
Yeah.
And then you had, these 70's bands, Kiss in 96. That was like one of the biggest tours. And then with the 80's, I could almost pinpoint it. I mean, they started getting back together 97, 98, but they're still playing the small clubs. I saw Motley Crue in Dayton, Ohio at a theater like a Masonic temple or something, maybe 2,000, 3,000 people. This would have been the winter of 98.
Oh, yeah.
So again, Motley Crue theater. That summer, they were playing Polaris Amphitheater, which was an 18,000 seater shed, now with the Scorpions. But
Yeah.
you could see where, to me, that's where that shift started.
Yeah. Right.
And it kind of matches right up with those early 2000s with the, started getting into the 80's. And I mean, you kind of see it 10 years ago. You had bands like Creed reforming.
Right.
So some of those bands for the late 90's. And if you just read the news, Sum 41 just announced that they're breaking up. But to me, that's a smart business move, because you can't have a reunion tour if you don't break up.
Right.
Right. So,
Right.
they didn't say they're, retiring. They're not having a farewell tour. It's just, hey, this is our last tour. So, hey, you break up, you get back together in 6 years, you have a big reunion tour, a couple
Right.
middle tours in there, and then you can do a farewell tour number 1. So, yeah, it's just,
Josh, you're familiar with the publicity spin. You sure are, man. You got it.
you gotta think, 10 years down the road.
Right.
But so Flock of Seagulls, and again, I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning of the episode, a little bit before my time. I mean, I was 82. I was I ran
Yeah.
82, 83
Yeah.
or somewhere around.
82.
So I would have been 5, 6 years old. But still cool. So how familiar, now I'm sure you probably became more familiar being on that circuit with them.
Yeah.
But let's say before that, how familiar were you with Flock of Seagulls? I mean,
Mm.
did you just know that one song? Did you know a couple others? In
Oh,
1982, if I tracked you down in Bozeman, Montana, would you have had the funky haircut? Well, what
no.
did you know about Flock of Seagulls before you kind of got into that world?
Well, I'm one of those guys that if a band is sort of typecast for having their one hit, I will purposely seek out the other songs, because for me, Space Age Love Song was the coolest song Flock ever did, right? So when I was discovering the new wave stuff, Space Age Love Song was one of my favorite songs of that era. And I did have the first record from back in the day, but it was buried beneath my Kiss records and beneath, all my Scorpion stuff, right? So I was definitely more the rocker guy. One thing I discovered, over time, like Animotion, even though like Obsession was like their big sort of break song, there's a ripping rock guitar solo in it, like just blistering solo. And that's what kind of set that band apart. They weren't just a synthesizer band. They actually there was a rock vibe with the guitars. Flock of Seagulls is known for their synthesizer sort of the impact they had in the synth world. The bands like New Order and OMD and Gary Newman and all these artists that are really synthesizer heavy. Depeche Mode was like the later part of that. There was this brilliant guitarist in A Flock of Seagulls who was 16 when Iran came out. And so he was a real innovator. I didn't know that about A Flock of Seagulls when I joined the band. I just discovered it over time. As fans have come to me and brought all this stuff to me, and I feel a little guilty that so many fans know tons more about the band that I'm in than I do. But
yeah, I mean, I always like that. I mean, when you think Flock of Seagulls, I think probably from the video, you think of the keyboards,
right,
and
yeah.
I always like. I mean, it's real simple riff, but that little echo, that whatever it is,
yeah,
I just always thought that was very cool. I mean, it's usually the easiest shit that sounds the best.
right.
But that's just with the echo and it just fits. That's the musical part that always I gravitated to.
Yeah,
And so
me too.
you're talking about the other stuff with guitars. It's kind of interesting that there's more beyond that. And I get the typecast thing. I mean, I'm the same way. If there's a band that I only know one song, I'll go check out more songs by that group. But usually, I'm like, yeah, there's just one song. But but every now and then you find a group where you dig into it and you're like, okay, there is other stuff there.
Just as an aside, because
Yeah.
I mean, they had, three like, top 20s that were big. And Wishing, I had a photograph of you, was another that I loved, but we did a show. And it's interesting that while Night Ranger and A Flock of Seagulls don't do a lot of shows together, we do have a show coming up like Labor Day, which is I'm super excited about together. But I know Night Ranger does a lot of stuff. They did Survivor, right? And John Waite, I think, as well. We played with both Survivor and John Waite in Chicago. And John Waite came back to me in the hallway and he said, "Man, you guys are doing Wishing, right?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course. You know the song?" And he goes, "That's the greatest rock ballad of the 80s." And I'm like, "What? How?" First of all, John Waite is brilliant, man. And he's such an amazing singer and wrote just huge songs, but that he would purposely seek me out and then throw a bone our way, and I had to tell our singer that. And he's like, "Oh, that's cool." It didn't really seem that big to him, but to me, that was super kudos, so
Mm-hmm.
but anyway.
Well, and it's crazy how some of these songs that were so huge have, I don't want to say are forgotten, but they're definitely, where you turn on 80s radio and you're going to hear songs, but like, let's say, what was the song you just mentioned? Not
Wishing or Space
well,
Age.
yeah. That was a big hit then, but you don't hear a lot of it now. Just like maybe like Sentimental Street and 4 in the Morning,
Right.
top 20, top 10 hit, but you very rarely will ever hear that on 80s rock or 80s stations. You always hear other songs, and it's just amazing what songs were so big at a time and then kind of have been forgotten, except for maybe the hardcore
Well,
fans.
to Flock's credit, like Mike Scores, the singer,
Mhm.
and God love that dude, man. He has done something right with licensing, because in 1 year span, he had like Space Age Love Song was in Spider-Man Homecoming. He had Atomic Blonde had Iran, Transformers had Iran. It was the same year La La Land had Iran, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, the video game. He still does very well 15 years after Grand Theft Auto Vice City came out. But I mean, but Space Age and Wishing both had prominent things in movies, which brings this whole generation of teenagers to our shows. When I see kids singing a lot of that stuff in the front row, I'm like, okay, how do you know this song? It's your parents just forcing the 80s stuff on you. And they're like, no, no, no. You know, Stranger Things and all these other TV shows and movies are bringing that stuff out. And so I don't know if our singers got, you know, a licensing attorney that's going out and shopping that stuff for them, but
hopefully he didn't lose it in like a divorce in 2002.
He owns it, man. He owns it. I mean, he's doing just fine with it, man. The pandemic didn't hurt him too much, not like the rest of us. You know,
I'm pretty sure he owns it. You know, what's this in my pocket? $100 bill. Get that out of here.
Like which of the 14 Porsches should I drive today? You know.
But yeah, I mean that is you know, even with like Night Ranger, you got that youth coming out, and
right.
I mean the resurgence of vinyl, I think helps it. You know, just having something tangible. I mean, I always collected vinyl because that's, you know, from that era, that's how they was originally intended to be released.
Yeah.
So, you know, I wanted all my 70s and 80s bands that I liked. I wanted the vinyl because it wasn't meant to be on a small CD case,
right,
or eventually a thumbnail, you know. So I liked having, and you know, it sucks now because, oh, I need that album. It's $50. I remember, I think I bought it, or I passed it up for $5 in 2001. But what do you think is the biggest like misconception? Like with me, I don't know shit about Flock of Seagulls. I know Iran. I know, you know, there's some very cool haircuts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it. What's the biggest misconception you think there is when it comes to Flock of Seagulls?
Well, you know, really expecting it to be all substance and no, you know, and style and no substance is one thing. You know, the haircut thing, that stuff goes away, right? The singer was a hairstylist. He owned a hair salon. Now he's completely bald. When people come to the show and they're disappointed that they don't see that, I've had a lot of people say, well, why doesn't he just wear a wig? Well, then it kind of cheapens his authenticity, right? He wants to be known for the songwriting and whatever. I think the songs, what I've found, the songs really impacted people at a time in their life when they needed something, you know, to hold on to. It's the songs that people made out to for the first time, or the songs that, you know, they got married to, and so there's something more to the substance of the song than just the aesthetic. And I am grateful when people tell me these stories, when they come out and they talk about that. Even though I wasn't in the band then, you know, it brings a little bit more responsibility for me to do it right, you know, to really serve it up. And my favorite thing is to meet people out on the road that have stories about how the songs impacted them. It is funny when people come up to Mike and they're like, hey, remember in 1982, you played our grad night at Disney. I was wearing that pink thing on my head. My girlfriend, she had a really nice, and sure, yeah, whatever, you know, don't remember those things, but people get so excited about that. So, you know, that is, I mean, I think you as a music fan, you know how the music made you feel, you know, and it's one thing to appreciate, you know, the chops, you know, like, you know, the dual guitar, Jeff Watson, Brad Gillis kind of stuff back in the early records, or, you know, the sort of the united front that band has always sort of presented when you see, but really the songs make you feel a certain way. You know, you talk Sentimental Street and 4 in the Morning, and you know, when you close your eyes, that's when I see people crying when they play that live. Because I've seen a lot of Night Ranger shows and I'm a fan, you know, through and through, but I love watching people's reaction, you know, and those songs really made people feel a certain way. And you know, so no one would ever say that Night Ranger was a band of just fluff, glam band, you know, a style band and no substance. You know, the songs were, you know, well crafted. there's huge hooks, and they weren't simplistic songs that were made to be sappy radio songs. Like there's complexity in the music. And one of my favorite things is to tell somebody that might not know their catalog very well, but I'll tell them to go pick apart like Kelly's drumming and say, yeah, it's not as easy as you think. Now try doing it and singing at the same time, right? And then it throws them off. And they're like, oh, okay, forget that, man. And they respect the band a little bit more. But with A Flock of Seagulls, there are some bands that were out there that were just, they were, well, when I think about the glam scene, the 80's glam scene, there were 1,000 bands that got signed in 1986 or whatever. And of those 1,000 bands, there were about 5 that were really killer, that kind of rose above the rest, right? And everybody else kind of tried to copy the style and the look, but they didn't have the substance that was down below. And so usually those bands that had the substance would stand the test of time, or the fans, and they would still, they might be touring today. People are still coming out for A Flock of Seagulls shows. It's awesome. I'm grateful for it. Man, I mean, I can't even think of the last 30 shows, we've had 2 that didn't sell out, and some great venues. I don't take any of that for granted. I'm so grateful.
I think too, just like, looking back on it, is, Flock of Seagulls didn't have that hit in 84, 85, 86 when there is a shit ton coming out on MTV. They were there right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So it's new and it's fresh, and everybody is flocking to it.
Right.
And so, whenever you think of the 80's, you think of MTV. Yeah. Well, if you're at the right age and that's just coming up, it's brand new. What video is kind of out there when it's new? There's not a lot of videos out there, so you're going to get a little bit more rotation.
Yeah.
So I think too, the timing of it was there at the beginning.
Oh yeah.
So it got a lot more exposure to where if it had just been 2 years, 3 years later, it might have just slid in there in the 80's. It would have been a hit, but maybe not when you're talking about those memories.
Yeah.
There's not 100 other videos at that same time you got memories tied to. There's just a few in 82, 83 that you have memories tied to.
You're so right, man. Yeah.
Good.
You were a little bit younger. You mentioned you were born in 77. So MTV coming out in 82, 83, you probably weren't watching MTV at that point, right?
Well, I mean, my aunt was 10 years older than me.
Okay.
And I always liked music. I mean, I had a 45 of John Lennon, Imagine, and all that shit. Or not Imagine, but a Woman. And I mean, I remember MTV, when they were still playing, what is it, the Bugles or whatever, Video Killed the Radio Star.
The Buggles, yeah.
Yeah, I don't, obviously not the first time, but like that was still in rotation.
Yeah.
I remember they would have like MTV Classics.
Yeah.
And it would be a half hour, but it was like the same videos all the time. It was like a Bruce Springsteen live video, Stop Dragging My Heart Around.
Yeah.
The Rolling Stones with like the parachute or something. So like I was watching it at a young age. Like my grandma took me to go see Night Ranger. I had just turned 8.
Wow. Nice, man.
So I was, watching that, but I will say that like that music wasn't mine. That's what got me to Night Ranger. Like my aunt had this Night Ranger record. I want you to listen to this. I'm like, I'll listen to it later. I'm playing video games or something. And that next day I listened to it. I'm like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
Like, why is Kaja Gugu on my fucking TV? And this isn't. And so that's what got me into Night Ranger. But I think it's like a very good example if you're out there listening and you're a Night Ranger fan, obviously like me. We get so built up in, well, Night Ranger had Dawn Patrol, Midnight Madness, blah, blah, blah. Man, Emotion's one of my favorite records. And then you had the Gary Moon era. Then I really liked Neverland when they got back together in the 90s. And Hole in the Sun was kind of a little bit of a turd, but whatever. And then like Somewhere in California in 2011 is great. And I really like Tie Road in 14, ATBPO in 2021. And you got all the stuff. Like you think everybody knows that. And there's people just like that with Flock of Seagulls.
Oh yeah.
Yet I know they had a record. I don't even know what it was called that had a few hits on it.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Right.
I don't know anything about the 90s or reunions.
Sure.
And so that's what we as Night Ranger fans have to realize, that 99.99999% of the people out there, think the same thing about Night Ranger.
Right. Yeah.
There was a record with Sister Christian,
Yeah.
and they had that one song, kind of like Wishing. It was Don't Tell Me You Love Me, and then When You Close Your Eyes, and maybe a smattering of others. But yeah, when you look back at these bands, there's a lot more than just their
Yeah.
iconic song. And as much as I'm sure there's Flock of Seagull fans like, oh god, why are they playing Iran? There's
Yep.
track 10 off that song in 1994 that they should be playing. And
Oh
but
yeah. Oh,
but if you go and look at the crowd when Iran comes on, people lose their shit.
they do.
And
Yeah. And they wait all night for it.
yeah,
No, I will tell you this, to your point. We played Disney World 2 weeks ago. Played 6 shows in Disney. Played 3 shows a night, 2 nights in a row. Half-hour sets. You got to play the hits, right? You would think. Kelly and I just talked about this. Not everybody goes to all 3 shows, right? There are people that come to one show and they don't see the second show. They don't see the third show. So you should do Space Age, Wishing, and Iran, I think, and they have a couple of other hits that were top 40 that the fans know, but you could fill that half hour with songs they had on the radio and be good. But our singer wanted to mix it up. So second set, no Iran, no Space Age. And people are coming to me like, what the? And including the promoter. And I'm like, dude, it's off. I had nothing to do with it. Talk to the boss, and I'm like, yeah, I know. And there are some people who are like, oh, smart move, man, not playing Iran, that'll keep people coming back for the third show. Well, no, you're at Disney World, people that their kids there, they're probably not wanting their kids to have to hang out for a while for the third show. But I know, I mean, you mentioned Springsteen. I was never a hardcore Springsteen fan, but all my buddies said, you got to see him once. I went, it's a 3.5 hour show, right? No breaks. And I knew Springsteen's hits from the radio, but he didn't do them. I knew one song. He did Born to Run. He didn't do Born in the USA. He didn't do Dancing in the Dark. He didn't do any of the hits. And there was a stadium full of people that ate it up, man. Nobody's walking out because he didn't do, Born in the USA, man. They were there to see Bruce do his thing. He gets a pass. I don't think A Flock of Seagulls gets a pass.
Speaking of Bruce, I love Bruce Springsteen, but so I went and saw him, and it was he was doing like an anniversary show of the record, The River, which is a double record.
Oh, great album.
So, he's playing 20 songs and he's playing it in order. He opens with a song that never made it on the record.
Wow.
All right. Which is fucking awesome.
Yeah.
It's a great song. And then he plays the whole record. So how long does that take? A couple hours?
Right.
So then, then he starts playing just, hits here. He did play Born in the USA, but then, they'd go to something else and Jungle Land. And, but he had played most of the hits. Like the 3.5 hour mark, he'd played Glory Days, Born to Run, Badlands, all those, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, what else is there to play? And then, so maybe like he's playing Badlands right now, and it's at the 3 hour, 45 minute. I'm like, this has got to be it. There, he's already played all these other hits.
Yeah.
Then they break into 10th Avenue Freeze Out.
Oh,
which is just a regular track off the Born to Run album. And I'm like, if he's playing this, anything's in the cards right now.
Right. Yeah.
And he played another song after that. He started at 8 o'clock on the dot, and I think they stopped like at 11:57.
Wow.
So like right, 4
Yeah.
hours.
My his hardcore fan, my buddies that are hardcore fans, and guys that know the crew and guys in the band, they've said, he shows up and there's no set list. He shows up and he'll call them out on stage. He'll just call it out and they've got their eye contact, and because the set's different every night. So, I mean, we go out and we'll do a 75-minute set and it's pretty much the same set every night. We'll mix it up some. But these guys were saying, yeah, no, Bruce's set is different every single night. And then friends of mine said the hotel that he was at has a community gym at the downstairs. 7 o'clock in the morning, he's down there pumping iron, at like, 6 hours after he finished coming off stage, after almost 4 hours playing, he's down there pumping iron in the morning, And I thought, okay, that dude deserves Hall of Fame and then some, right? So that's
he like I was amazed too when I saw him. They were doing Hungry Heart, and he had the stage, and then they had a like a ramp, like an ego ramp, but two of them on each side of the stage that went out, and then it cut through the middle of the floor. So that goes okay. So
yeah.
he went out during Hungry Heart, during like the midsection, went out all the way to where the stage was in the middle of the floor. And so what, maybe 30 rows back from the main stage, and he just kind of like points to where he's at now and points to the front of the stage, and he turns around, opens his arms, and just falls back, and they take him all the way to the
Nice,
front.
man.
No security, nothing. I was just so surprised. Like, that's a lot of trust.
Yeah.
But
that guy's such a badass, man.
and another story, you'll probably like this with the drum wise. I think it was right around the River session, so it would have been like late 70s. Max
Weinberg.
Yep, Max Weinberg. He just wasn't cutting, like, he was not keeping up with the rest of the band, and he'd already been there a couple albums, and Max is getting all worried, and Bruce pulled him aside, and he's like, who's your drumming hero? He goes, Ringo Starr. He goes, you need to call him and see what he did and get it figured out. And that's all he said to him. And he called Ringo and did stuff. And, because he was close to probably getting the boot, which, he didn't want to do. But I just like that story where he's like, who's your drumming inspiration, your hero? And Ringo Starr. Well, you need to call him and get this figured out. And what's great too about The River is he had a whole album recorded, 10 songs done, ready to go, and he pulled it back and scrapped it all, re-recorded a few of the songs, and did that double record.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 or 3 songs from that original record made it on to The River, but he released a box set. So there's like 20 songs that, that he kind of like did nice demos of. A person probably could have made a career off those 20 songs. Like there's a song on there called Roulette that is just fantastic, that that he left off that record. Yeah. So welcome to the Bruce Springsteen podcast.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, man.
Well, yeah. You can't go wrong with I always said Born to Run's probably the quintessential #1 rock song. It's got everything. It's got the raspy vocals. Rock's supposed to have raspy vocals. It's got it's got the rebellion lyrics, like hey, I'm going to grab my girl and
take on the world.
It's got just that, even though it's a saxophone.
Oh yeah, but that's rock and roll sax, man. Clarence.
It's got the dun 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 where it breaks down, dun dun, and it's kind of just holding those notes. That's what
it's an anthem.
Yeah, and then
it's an anthem.
Bam, comes back and punches you. To me, Born to Run that's everything. What does a rock song got to have? It's got to have all this.
Yeah.
But anyway, so
Nice.
so
Thanks, Coach.
so so where were you when welcome to the hour 30 mark where we start talking about Night Ranger. The where were you when you first became aware of Night Ranger? Do you remember just what?
Yep. 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 It was at Four Seasons Arena in Great Falls, Montana.
Night Ranger.